The most transformative knowledge about healing was erased from the official Gospels. This was a teaching so precise that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm it within psychoneuroimmunology and epigenetics laboratories. This truth could potentially free millions of people from unnecessary suffering, yet it remained hidden for 2 millennia. Sickness does not come from the outside. It is not a form of divine punishment, nor is it simply bad luck. It is not merely genetics or bacteria isolated from the internal context. Jesus revealed that illness has a specific internal emotional and spiritual origin, which was documented by his Gnostic disciples and then deliberately suppressed. Why was this done? Because a human being who understands that the root of their illness is within them and that the power of their healing also resides there, does not need religious intermediaries or control systems that manage their access to the sacred and to health. What I am about to share with you today is the missing link between Jesus' teachings on healing and the profound concept of the monad, the divine spark that dwells within every human being, serving as the connection point between the individual and the whole. For the Gnostics, the monad was the divine core, the indivisible particle of pure consciousness that constitutes our true identity. It is precisely this concept that Jesus used when he spoke about the kingdom of heaven being within you. The monad is this inner kingdom, this light that, when recognized and activated, has the power to completely transform our physical reality. To understand what Jesus taught about illness, we first need to understand how the Gnostics understood the relationship between the inner world and the physical world. For them, there is no real separation between what happens in your mind, in your emotions, in your spiritual state, and what manifests in your physical body. The body is not an independent machine that functions by its own biological laws, isolated from the consciousness that inhabits it. It is the densest and most visible expression of a complete field of consciousness that includes thoughts, emotions, spiritual patterns, and the degree of connection or disconnection of the soul with its origin in the pleroma, which the Gnostics called the divine fullness, and which is intimately linked to the concept of the monad. What first becomes unbalanced in the inner world eventually manifests in the outer world of the body. Physical illness is always, from a Gnostic perspective, the last stage of a process that began much earlier in more subtle layers of human experience. It is the body speaking in the only language that a mind disconnected from its inner nature can hear when it has ignored more subtle messages for too long. In the Gospel of John, chapter 5, Jesus heals a paralyzed man who had been unable to walk for 38 years. But what institutional Christianity never explains is the precise instruction Jesus gave him after the healing. He didn't just tell him to go and live in peace. He said, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you." In the Gnostic context, this statement is not a moral threat. It is a clinical diagnosis. Jesus was pointing precisely to the fact that the physical paralysis had its origin in an internal pattern, in an error of alignment with his own divine nature, with his monad, and that if this pattern did not transform, the body would manifest the illness again because the cause would remain active. The Gnostics identified three fundamental roots from which all illness emerges. They called them the three unhealthy passions of the soul. The first is spiritual ignorance, the forgetting of one's own luminous nature, living completely identified with the body, personality, and history without any contact with the spark of the pleroma, with the monad that constitutes the truest identity of the human being. The second is pathological desire, chronic lack, the sustained feeling that something essential is missing for life to be complete. It is the misalignment with the inherent fullness of the monad. The third is hatred in its multiple forms, sustained resentment, chronic guilt, and relentless judgment of oneself and others. It is the denial of the fundamental unity that the monad represents. These three roots are not abstract concepts. They have specific biochemical correlates documented by modern science. Spiritual ignorance, living completely disconnected from any deep inner dimension and disconnected from the monad, produces a chronic activation of the stress axis in the nervous system, which modern researchers directly associate with systemic inflammation, immune suppression, and accelerated cellular aging. Pathological desire produces a chronic frustrated activation of the dopamine reward circuit, which generates states of anxiety, depression, and compulsion with measurable effects on heart coherence and the immune system. Sustained resentment produces what psychoneuroimmunology researchers call a cytokine storm of inflammation. Dr. Candace Pert, whose revolutionary work on neuropeptides showed that emotions have receptors in every cell of the body, documented that sustained negative emotions produce specific chemical compounds that literally inflame tissues. Resentment has a biochemistry, chronic fear has a biochemistry, and this biochemistry produces illness. In the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, a Nag Hammadi text that many scholars consider to preserve direct teachings from Jesus' disciples, it is described that the word pronounced from gnosis, from the direct recognition of one's own luminous nature and of the monad, has the power to deconstruct illness from its root because it attacks the pattern of consciousness that generated it instead of simply suppressing the physical symptom, which is its final expression. Jesus practiced exactly this when he healed. He didn't perform external magical rituals. He initiated in the sick person a process of accelerated gnosis, of direct self-knowledge, of recognizing the internal root of the illness, and simultaneously the luminous nature, the monad that could dissolve that root. When he said to the blind man, "Your faith has healed you," he wasn't talking about passive religious belief. He was describing the effect of active gnosis, of the experiential recognition of one's own divine nature, of the monad on the nervous system and, through it, on the physical body. The phrase he pronounced to Martha in the Gospel of John before raising Lazarus is the most precise synthesis of all his teaching on healing. He said, "Woman, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" In the Gnostic context, seeing the glory of God is not an external supernatural event. It is gnosis, the direct experience of the monad's own luminous nature, which, when it genuinely occurs, produces effects that the material world calls miracles because it has no other vocabulary to describe what happens when consciousness operates from its deepest level instead of from its conditioned patterns of fear and forgetfulness. Jesus was what the Gnostics called an initiator, a master who initiated in the patient the process of self-knowledge that dissolved the internal root of the illness, that awakened the awareness that the power of healing was not outside, but within, that the hidden wisdom the patient needed was not external medical information, but the direct recognition of their own divine nature, of their monad, which was being obscured by the three roots of ignorance, pathological desire, and hatred that generated the illness. Now let's move on to the concrete practices of the true antidote that Jesus transmitted, integrating the concept of the monad as the center of these practices. The first practice is the activation of healing gnosis through self-knowledge. Every morning for 10 minutes, sit in silence and ask yourself the question that Gnostic masters considered the most therapeutic of all. Not what hurts me, not what symptom do I have, but who am I beyond this body, this emotion, and this story? Allow yourself to feel, even briefly, the spark of the pleroma, the monad that Jesus taught, which lives in every human being as their truest nature. Not as an exercise in imagination, but as active recognition. From this recognition, visualize the light of the spark, this monad, expanding toward each area of the body that needs healing. This practice activates in the nervous system the heart coherence and parasympathetic response that researchers at the HeartMath Institute directly associate with immune system restoration. Jesus called this lighting the inner lamp. Neuroscience calls it vagal activation. It is the same process described from two vocabularies separated by 2,000 years. The second practice is the medicinal word. The Gnostics taught that precisely and intentionally pronouncing the knowledge of the monad's own nature has direct therapeutic effects because the word pronounced from gnosis reorganizes the thought patterns that generate the biochemistry of illness. The practice consists of identifying the internal pattern that you feel is most associated with your illness process, be it fear, resentment, lack, or disconnection, and then audibly pronouncing for 5 consecutive minutes the opposite affirmation from the recognition of your luminous nature, of your monad, not as a superficial positive affirmation, but as active gnosis pronounced from genuine contact with the spark of the pleroma, with the monad that you activated in the first practice. The difference between a conventional positive affirmation and the Gnostic medicinal word is precisely that the first comes from the will of the personality, while the second comes from the recognition of one's own divine nature, of the monad, and their biological effects are completely different. The third practice is the awakening of consciousness through the alchemy of resentment. Sustained resentment is the most documented disease-generating pattern in modern research. Studies with long-term cancer survivors consistently show that the genuine release of resentment is one of the most significant factors associated with remission. Jesus directly prescribed this when he said that forgiveness frees those who forgive. In Gnostic practice, the process of freeing oneself from resentment does not begin from moral will, but from self-knowledge. First, you identify the root of the resentment, the original pain, the moment of forgetting your divine nature, your monad, which made you vulnerable to that harm. Then from the spark of the pleroma of the monad, you observe the person or situation you resented, recognizing that their harm also emerged from their own forgetting of their luminous nature, not as a justification for what they did, but as an understanding of its origin. This deep understanding, which is only possible from gnosis and not from the wounded personality, is what Gnostic texts call alchemy, which transforms poison into medicine, and its effects on the body's biochemistry are immediate and measurable. The fourth practice is connection with the inner divine, with the monad as the primary source of healing. Every night before sleeping, dedicate 5 minutes to consciously recognize that the power of healing is not in any external source. It is in the luminous nature of the pleroma, in the monad that lives within you. Bring your attention to the center of your chest. Feel the spark, the monad, and from that spark, direct a simple, anxiety-free intention toward each area of the body that needs restoration. Not as a plea to an external being, but as the activation of an internal capacity that has always been present, but which the forgetting of one's own divine nature of the monad kept inaccessible. This nightly practice activates the cellular repair processes that naturally occur during sleep, but which are significantly enhanced when the nervous system enters the state of coherence that the recognition of one's own divine nature of the monad produces. What can you expect from these practices applied with discipline? In the first 3 days, the morning practice of healing gnosis will produce a physical sensation of warmth and expansion in the center of the chest, which is the parasympathetic nervous system's response to the activation of the vagus nerve through deep self-knowledge. This physical sensation is not imagination. It is the biological confirmation that the process Jesus described is occurring. In the first week, the consistently pronounced medicinal word will begin to produce moments of mental stillness that dramatically contrast with the habitual thought patterns that generated the biochemistry of illness. The nervous system is learning a new pattern of operation from gnosis, from the monad, instead of from forgetfulness. In the first month, if these practices are maintained with consistency, without fanaticism, but with inner fidelity, the effects cease to be merely subjective. They begin to become concrete. You may notice improvement in sleep quality, reduction of persistent physical tension, decrease in pain associated with accumulated emotional stress, more energy available throughout the day, more mental clarity, and a feeling of lightness in the body as if something dense is finally being dissolved. This happens because many physical sufferings are fueled by an invisible internal overload, repressed guilt, resentment held for years, constant fear, chronic emotional tension, and a sense of separation and spiritual abandonment. The body carries all of this and carries it in silence until the moment you stop feeding these structures and begin to release what has been held for so long. The alchemy of resentment, when truly practiced, is not merely symbolic. It has real consequences because prolonged resentment is not just a negative emotion. It is a form of energetic, mental, and biological imprisonment. When you let go, the body feels it. When you forgive, even in layers, the body feels it. When you stop internally reliving the same pain every day, the body finally begins to come out of a state of war. And a body that comes out of war can finally begin to repair itself. The challenges are predictable. The mind, conditioned for years to seek healing exclusively from external sources, will resist these practices, telling you that they are insufficient, that you need something more, or that it's too simple to be real. This resistance is exactly the pattern of spiritual ignorance that Jesus identified as the first root of illness, the chronic dependence on external healing sources as the only valid option. Recognize this in practice anyway. Jesus healed bodies because he understood exactly where illness came from the soul's disconnection from its divine nature, from its monad, and from forgetting what a human being is at the deepest level. And the antidote he transmitted was not an external ritual or a dogma to be obeyed. It was self-knowledge, gnosis, the direct recognition of one's own luminous nature, of the monad, which when it genuinely occurs, simultaneously transforms consciousness and the biochemistry of the body that consciousness inhabits. Tonight before sleeping, practice connecting with the inner divine, with your monad. 5 minutes. Center of the chest, the spark, anxiety-free intention toward what needs to be restored, and sleep from that light. Illness was born within, in forgetfulness, in disconnection, in the three roots that Jesus identified 2,000 years ago, and that modern science is now confirming. Healing is also born within, in self-knowledge, in gnosis, in the recognition of the luminous nature of the monad, which never disappeared but simply waited to be remembered. Jesus knew this, and now you know it too. Write in the comments, I reconnect to my inner monad to heal. Share this video with someone who is going through a process of illness, because what you've just learned could be exactly the dimension of healing that no doctor mentioned. If this ancient knowledge about the monad and inner healing has transformed your perception of health, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. We are dedicated to uncovering the history and wisdom they tried to bury. Cultivate your inner temple and Gyotrung Tong Lai. The next treasure of knowledge will be revealed soon.